Howdy, howdy. Okay. Been ages since I've done this. There we go. Sweet. Man, it has been a while. What have you been up to? I mean, I guess that's a pretty
Uh,
broad question. You've been up to a lot.
yeah, I've been up to a lot. I've been up to a lot. I've been mostly filming documentaries along the front line in Ukraine with drone crews, mortar crews, artillery crews, assault infantry, convict soldiers, all sorts of drone crews. There's many different types of drone crews. Civilian evacuation, different aid groups, churches, just whatever really I can get a camera on. And I've been releasing the documentaries intermittently. Last month, I released a documentary called, Russians like human hunt in Kherson, or it's a documentary on the human safari. There's been many reports on, and that took a while, but I was very proud of that one. This upcoming Saturday, I'm going to be releasing a embed with convict soldiers, where these are people who are in the Ukrainian prison system and they signed contracts to join with the Ukrainian armed forces and fight on the front lines in exchange for their personal freedom, so that when the war is over, they can like get out of prison. And I was very interested in that as a concept because Ukraine's extremely starved for manpower, and due to the historical treatment of prisoner soldiers, I wanted to see how these people were being treated and where they were fighting. And they were fighting on the worst parts of the front.
Yeah.
And they got extremely tough contracts, and they have to make do with what they got. But they're a very hardy bunch of guys. I can say that for sure. Like talking to them about their wounds, it's just kind of like, it's almost like they pull out like a scroll and it kind of rolls down.
Yeah, okay, so a million questions that I want to ask. Okay, obviously, don't spoil. You know, we got to watch the documentaries. However, generally speaking, how are they doing? I mean, you'd expect that essentially like a penal legion would be subjected to the worst conditions. Do they think they're getting like a raw deal, or are they more or less like happy that they get the chance to serve their country and get out earlier potentially?
I mean, they're all aware that their deal isn't great. But when I talk to people about the circumstances of the deal, where if you sign like a normal contract, you'll serve for a certain period of time, and then you got the opportunity to go if you make it to the end of that period, or you get wounded otherwise, and so you can no longer serve. But with these contracts that they have, once they're in Skaval, which is the name of the unit, translates roughly to like gust of wind, powerful force of wind. There's not like a direct translation, but you get the idea, you know? You're in it till it's over. You're either wounded and you're taken off the battlefield, you're killed, or the war's over. Those are the only circumstances that you're no longer with Skaval. So it's a really tough contract that there's not really any other equivalent in the armed forces of Ukraine. But the types of crimes you can get into Skaval for up include like manslaughter. So this is, possibly getting you out of some serious prison time, and the Ukrainians are in an extremely difficult position. And so I was really just I wasn't interested in necessarily like, I'm going to come here with my moral crusade about what I think about prisoner soldiers. I just wanted to see what these guys thought of their experience, document what's happening, and I'll leave the rest to the, I guess the people in HR.
Yeah, this is something that I've worried about a little bit, I guess, when we look at Ukraine in retrospect, right? Which is that Ukraine, for the most part, has been pretty transparent about what it does, the penal legions, the extent to which it engages in warfare, the strikes that it takes both within Ukrainian and Russian territory. And as a consequence, Ukraine has done plenty of things, like as a nation, obviously, that we kind of morally bristle at. It's war, that's sort of the nature of these things. Historically, like when the the Allied campaign was moving into Europe, D-Day and so on, for the most part, the government would just cover up everything, right? Like the Allied governments would just cover up any bad things that happened, which of course they did, because obviously they want people to stay focused on the broader story, which is we're beating the Nazis, which is great. Nowadays, it's almost impossible to do that. Because of social media, because of, drone warfare. It's easy to check what governments are doing. And the concern that I've had is that because Ukraine is transparent and owns up to what it does for the most part, and Russia does not, people are going to come away from this conflict with a more relatively negative impression of Ukraine than is warranted. They're going to focus on what is admitted, acknowledged, and transparent, and the cloud of Russian disinfo. Like, for example, the over in the West, largely because of the Republicans, we've talked about in America, like in political discourse, the treatment of Ukrainian soldiers by Ukraine. But for the most part, you know, over here in America, we don't talk about like what Russia's doing. I can tell you that the human safari, for example, like outside of the sources that I've seen it talked about, it's certainly not a subject in like mainstream conversation. Do you ever worry that Ukraine's going to get like a bad rap after the fact?
I mean, I understand that there's a problem with transparency. I think the transparency is important. I think the fact that I can come here and I can interview, for example, 2 days ago, I released an article with Offbeat Research that was interviewing a defector. Somebody who, well, no, a deserter. Defector is not the right word. A deserter. Somebody who left the Ukrainian armed forces because he believed that his commanding officer did not have his best interest at heart. He was with the 155th Mechanized Brigade, which had a huge scandal because of how poorly it was ran. And it was the one that was trained with the French in France. And it was supposed to be this great symbol of French-Ukrainian cooperation. But then when it ended up coming back to Ukraine, even before it came back to Ukraine, they had desertions because people couldn't see the writing on the wall. And a lot of the people who were there didn't want to be there. And it's one thing to be there and not want to be there, but then you combine that with what you believe are low odds because you don't have officers that care, or you see open graft, which I had reports of people like stealing volunteer stuff that volunteers, dedicated for the cause and stuff. When people, take out their time to bring stuff over from, other countries, and then it's in some instances it's stolen. And I've heard reports of, them being not given sufficient training, or the training is not of of good quality. And so people make the decision to jump. And I'm able to report on the problems with the Ukrainian armed forces with the hope that maybe there'll be some improvements. That's my personal hope, but also I'm able to record it for the historical record, which is important in its own right. I think the historical record in and of itself is very important. And so I think that by making this out in the open, there can be an open societal discussion. And now the 155 is well known for its failures. And so now they're trying to rebranding, they're getting new imagery. And even if it ends up not being anything, the fact that they have to go through this and respond to public criticism shows that there is a value here. But the fact that I can do this in Ukraine and I'm not fearful that I'm going to get arrested at some checkpoint is pretty good. That's not to say that everything here when it comes to the media is perfect, that's for sure. But they are improving, and democracies are flawed projects, and people got to keep working at it.
Yeah, it's difficult. I don't know if I did a good job phrasing the question initially, I guess. Just in the long run, the propaganda campaign from both sides, we know what the Russian strategy is, which is just a cloud of disinformation. Everything is this and that, A and B at the same time. Even the most ridiculous lies are thrown out and like confidently re-expressed because it doesn't matter. You can't debunk everything. And even if you do, no one's there to listen. It's just, there aren't really equivalent military campaigns like that anymore. Nowadays, it's all war on terror crap. You bomb some underdeveloped country. Ukraine and Russia are both, I mean, they're not really peers militarily, I guess, for a wide variety of like economic and population-based reasons. The fact that Russia functionally is a petrostate, but they've held the line for years now. It's really like the only example we have of this kind of conflict in the modern age, in the post-social media age. And I don't know. I guess I just kind of hope at the end of everything, like Ukraine gets some deserved accolades, both for what they've done and for what they've managed to keep themselves from becoming under these circumstances. Does that make sense?
I think people need to remember to keep this whole war in perspective, because the way I was convinced to come to this country in the first place wasn't just like, oh, this is a really big historical moment. It was, I was told that, number one, this wasn't going to happen. And then I was told, okay, well, if it does happen, it's going to be over in 3 weeks. And neither of these things came to be. And what I saw instead was a culture that had its own national story and history that it wanted to tell, that was resisting invasion and occupation, that the whole world thought would take over in the entire country. And it seemed to me that the people who were the most grounded were those that were on the ground and were, getting sources either from within the Ukrainian armed forces. Like I remember Ben Hodges was definitely one of the bigger suits, you could say, that were on point. And that's because he was with the Ukrainian armed forces, helping them train them to NATO standards. So he understood what they could do. So I felt that I had to kind of go and cover it and try to make sure that this story was told, because now we talk about this as if like, oh my gosh, Ukraine is in a position where they're losing how many villages over how many weeks, when originally the idea was the Russians were going to crush the entire country within a few weeks, and not, oh, they're going to take this many villages or that many villages in these many weeks, after American aid had essentially been dwindled down to nothing over 4 months, when there's not a consistent political will behind Ukraine's defense, when the sanction screws had not been tightened. And after 3 years, Russia's still going through the slog. And the review from most people, I think from the Russian perspective, after this is over, is probably going to be, my God, how do we avoid like something like that happening again? Because it has been an abject failure in comparison to what everyone expected. But because we've now shifted this dynamic to, oh, well, because Ukraine's losing this many villages over, a week and a half, they lose a village or 2 villages at a time. They're losing the war. How can we offer Russia everything in the moon because they're losing the war in this tiny little time frame, without taking into account how much Russia is losing for that much territory, without taking into account what the original prospects of the war was. I mean, even when people say, oh, what's the whole point of fighting this whole war for the last 2.5 years? We're right back to a deal. The Ukrainians took back Kherson, which the Russians occupied. The Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of much of the Kharkiv region. So this shows that, the Ukrainians had a capacity to overrun the Russians when they were on a relatively peer-on-peer basis, or could overwhelm them in short bursts of attack. So in my mind, Ukraine has outperformed all expectations, and it deserves to be covered in that way, but that also doesn't make them Superman. So they can't overcome everything without, you can't mythologize them.
Not just,
you make them into non-humans.
Not just logistically either, but like morally to a large extent. I think there's a reason why basically all of Western Europe looks to Zelensky as a kind of moral core right now. The applause that he got, of course, after the Pope's funeral, was dead silent when Trump came in. Then Zelensky came in, everyone clapped. It's not easy. I mean, in the position Zelensky is in, I think a lot of other leaders in a lot of other countries, especially countries that are as I want to say underdeveloped, but like obviously politically, Ukraine's always been kind of in a shaky state, for a wide variety of reasons. The fact that they've held firm on an ideological level, I think, is really impressive. A lot of people are worried. This is a concern, I think, that was a little less founded initially, but now that the war has turned into like an interminable slog, trenches, landmines, drone warfare, people are concerned about what Ukraine will look like after any victory. So whether the line holds here, whether the Donbass is retaken, whether Crimea is retaken, whatever the likelihood of those things happening are, I think people are concerned that like there's going to be basically an indefinite DMZ between Ukraine and Russia. You've walked the country. I haven't. Do you think there's a potential for future stability in Ukraine after the war? It's like, say the war is done and there aren't constant ceasefire violations. Do you think people there could return to normal?
I mean, it all depends upon what security foundation is placed, because there's 2 risks. There's a risk of all-out war, which is what everybody fears most of all, is the idea that the Russians do a third wave, 2014, 2022, and maybe, I don't know, 2028, 2029, whatever the year would be. But another thing that I think is a more slow boiling, I think more pernicious type of aggression would be the flare up here, the flare up there. Oh, there was 3 airstrikes in the last month. Oh, there was 6 this month. oh, is this company now going to invest in this frontline community and rebuilding if we don't really know if it's really off? I mean, they say it's off, but it's not really off. But is it enough of a lash out to make Romania and Moldova and Hungary and all these other European states act? That slow boil is something that makes me a lot more nervous because it could ease into the hot war, because you could slowly go from 6 airstrikes to 10 to 11 to 12, and before you know it, you're right back to a small scale to going large scale offensive, depending if they find some success. Than necessarily just another sudden wave or another sudden roll of the dice, where the Russians might be a little bit more hesitant next time to ease themselves into it, considering their cold shower experience. But that is something that I fear, which would not only freeze investment in rebuilding, but could also be a mechanism to re-enter the war. And that is something that I hear a lot of nervousness about as well. And that's why I think there needs to be strong security assurances that if something like that happens, there's going to be a response. That, you know, there's mechanisms to put sanctions immediately back in place. Sanctions slowly are rolled back. They're not immediately pulled back, as I'm sure many in Donald Trump's ears is asking him to do. There's mechanisms by which if Russia does something, they know they're going to immediately be responded to with either force or some other detrimental, response.
It seems like obviously ethnic tension as a concept isn't new. That's been around forever. It seems like most post World War II land disputes don't really settle anymore. Right? Unless it's in like total conquest, right? So the Koreas are still fighting. Obviously, Pakistan, India are going at it right now. I guess you have like the breakup of Yugoslavia, and you still have like tensions between, I don't know, Kosovo and Albania and Serbia and what have you. And then you've got Ukraine and Russia. It seems like you have these like decades long, like effective lines of control or DMZs, or just like there's never a resignment. You know what I mean? There's never like a catharsis to the tension. Because I can't imagine what it would look like as long as Russia looks anything like it does today. I mean, anything at all like it. Within decades, 100 years from now, will there not always be tension at the border? I guess I just can't imagine a situation where, even with strong security assurances, this could ever really be settled. I mean, you would need some kind of like regime change in Russia.
I'm sorry I can't be like the wish fairy here and tell you that, there's this magical Russian liberal that's going to float down from the sky,
God willing, and
tell them like lynch, genocide bad. And then like, they're like, oh, they learned something. I don't know. That's not going to happen. So I need to be realistic about the fact that this doesn't die with Putin. I think that there's some people who are of the idea that once Putin's gone, the next Russian leader will come in and you'll get a role of like the D20. And maybe if you hit something lucky, you'll get like the nice, reasonable Russian. When most likely, whoever takes Putin's place is going to be somebody who's going to be absolutely terrified, no matter however they outwardly present, because they're filling the biggest power vacuum to ever power vacuum in modern Russian politics. They're filling gigantic shoes. And there's not going to be, if they become another Putin, another chance for somebody else to grab that mantle of power. And so they're going to be extremely vulnerable in that period. And so if they in that moment say, look, I'm going to reform here, I'm going to reform there, that, that KGB, that NKVD pedophile dude, Bay Area, I forgot how to pronounce his name, but part of the reason that he failed and he did not end up controlling the entirety of the Soviet Union wasn't because he was just like a personal monster. It was because many within the Soviet establishment think he was too reconciliatory in some ways, and that presented a weakness that was then exploited upon by his opposition. And so there will be some amount of fear that if you come in after a strong man like Putin and then say, let's all be friends with the West a little bit and compromise here, compromise there to re-enter the markets, unless you can really get enough oligarchs on board to like sign off on that because of the profitability or like there's no other option, it could be presented as extremely weak, and then it could hurt you. And it might be a lot easier just go rah rah and hit the war drum. So I don't think this ends with Putin. I think this is a long established Russian imperial idea of the Ruski Mir that is way before Putin and will live on after Putin. And I think that flag is a lot easier than the flag of liberalization when there's, I mean, all the power is directed towards an illiberal model.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I guess my hope is like, obviously it's all economics at a on a macro level, right? Like there are people in Russia who think that this game is better played in this position. The oligarchs think they can still maintain their power and privilege if this continues. They think it's better than being sort of like subsumed by Western economic hegemony. And it seems like the plan was basically, at least to a large extent, what if we just turned America into Russia, right? Like what if the Trump administration is absolutely full of Russophiles, people with close contact to the Kremlin, people who praise Putin, including to an extent Trump himself. I guess I was pretty optimistic, and I still am, I think, about the mineral deal, as exploitative as it will be in the future. The fact that it sets a material incentive for continued military investment in Ukraine, the fact that the trust isn't paying out to anyone but Ukraine for a long time to come, and the fact that it seems kind of contrary to what the narrative was leading up to the signing of the deal. Like for months and months and months, Trump has been banging on about how Zelensky is a dictator and Zelensky, is oppressing his people and he won't allow for elections and so on. And then he quieted down about it after beefing with Putin. And now it seems like we might be leaning more into the continued support for the slog, which is better than us abandoning Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
So
I mean,
is that good? Like, are you happy about that?
Putin's greed consumed him. He was given basically the opportunity to freeze the lines where they are. The Trump administration gave him a legal pathway to normalization of the annexation of Crimea, which maybe the Ukrainians wouldn't have accepted, but that could have been the official position of the Trump administration. That could have put the Ukrainians in a difficult position, but the Russians wouldn't accept anything but the full cessation of Kherson, the places where they're hunting humans. Or Zaporizhia, a city of 700,000 people, they haven't even gotten close to capturing. Or the rest of Donetsk, like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk and Konstantinivka and all these places, they are not yet close to capturing. So when these are the Russian demands, and then they're stacking demilitarization on top of it, these are insults to anybody who has to view this semi-realistically, and it's not literally just, okay, Putin, I will divide up Ukraine with you. I am in your pocket. I am with you. And so I think that this shows that Trump isn't literally in Putin's pocket, ready to divide up the world, or if he is, he feels like he's not in a comfortable enough position to move on that because after that was shot down, I think Trump was kind of embarrassed because he really thought he could just kind of shimmy up there, fix it all, and it would be, he thought he could end it. And so now he's in the difficult position of having to pick up the pieces, and he's going to end up doing what was something I feared from the start, that he was just going to do a weaker version of what Biden. So he's going to end up failing negotiations, sending less aid than Biden to at least keep the situation stable because he doesn't want another crisis on his hands. But also less because he doesn't want to look like a sucker because of all of his campaign nonsense, even though on the campaign trail he said if the Russians failed to come to the table, he would send even more aid and put even more pressure on the Russians. But all I've heard about is more pressure on the Russians, nothing about giving the Ukrainians the tools necessary to protect their manpower.
Yeah, so I imagine that the average Ukrainian probably isn't too keen on Trump for a variety of obvious reasons.
His popularity rating has crashed. I mean, it went from, I think it was 47 to 44, 47 dislike, 44 like, right? Or like trust. I think the rating was trust. And now it was like 89% distrust, like nearly 90% distrust. And it's collapsed, man.
Is there a lot of optimism about Western Europe's rearmament? That enormous, like German rearmament and the security guarantees from France and the UK and what have you?
There's some hope about more security support. There seems to be a lot of love for the United Kingdom here because the United Kingdom is generally speaking been pretty consistent on like state policy towards Ukraine. There is some excitement about the new MERS government from the CDU. He's somebody who's always been kind of in favor of aid to Ukraine, and now with the elimination on the debt cap when it comes to German defense spending and on aid to aggressed upon nation states, which I mean, who could that be? I wonder what that is. Oh, you can send as much aid to an aggressed upon what nation? So there's some hope about that.
It's Pakistan,
and
actually.
there is
it's all going
the
to Pakistan.
100. Yeah, it's all going to Pakistan. But $150 billion for a joint procurement is from the EU is something that's going to help. Joint procurement is really important because they haven't had full stockpiles and artillery shells and rockets and munitions to give the Ukrainians, and now to rearm themselves. Now that they've given the Ukrainians most of their Cold War stockpiles, and there's just not many Cold War stockpiles to draw from anymore, they're going to just have to build or acquire them from third parties. That, I mean, India and Pakistan, that was where they were getting a lot of their shells. So I wonder how that's going to go now.
Yeah, it seems I don't want to resign the odds of bad things happening. I don't want to jinx it, basically. It does kind of seem like even if they muster again and again, there's just a limit to what Russia can expect to get at this point. Like you said, they got greedy, which I completely believe, right? Because they're high on their own supply. There's a bunch of Kremlin propaganda about how, because every fascist country does this, right? Like any day we could annihilate Ukraine, we're toying with them, et cetera, et cetera. So they get bogged down. By the way,
this was the common like Ukrainian soldier take on the war on Trump's election. This was always the thing that kind of soothed me. They always said Trump can believe whatever he wants. He'll interact with Putin for a few months. He'll eventually get burned, and then he'll come back, and then he'll have to support us. That was like the kind of boomer Ukrainian soldier take that ended up probably being true.
It's working. Yeah. It seems like genuinely like it wasn't even like complicated finagling in the back. Putin just flattered Trump. And then Trump got upset because he didn't get what he wanted immediately, which
they thought that painting was going to do it. The painting and the prayer when he was shot.
It might have worked on me. I don't. Do you think the lines can really advance in either direction from where they are now? I mean, we've all seen the satellite photos where there's just like a 50-mile wide stretch of trenches and landmines, and the way drone warfare works, it seems like. I mean, it seems like proper World War I shit. I can't really imagine there's anything.
The lines can advance. The lines can advance. I think the Ukrainians and the Russians have proved it. The Ukrainians, through the attack into Kursk, have proved that if they have the equipment, if they have the drone jamming equipment, if they have the armored vehicles, if they have the ammunition supply, if they can do proper recon and get their troops and really surprise the enemy, which they were able to do. And I also talked about in a separate documentary about the Sumy region that people can check out. But they showed that they can move the line. And the Russians showed that they can move the line back. And the Russians showed through the advance up to Pokrovsk that they can continue to move the line. But the hope for many of the Russian, I will say, end Kriegers, right? These people who really want to, we will get the final victory against Ukraine one day. We will take Kiev and we will smash. These guys' dream is the idea that Russia's big force, this is how they win wars, is they take resources and men from every part of Russia, the biggest country on earth, they take it together and they put it into a big fist. And then they take that fist of men with dreams and hopes and ambitions and with wives and children and families, and they smash them over and over and over again in their opponent. And then once they finish smashing them into their opponent, eventually their opponent's smashed. And they'll be able to. That's my brutalist way of describing the strategy. Russia's bigger. It is an empire, and it will be able to take Ukraine eventually by just overpowering it with men. And that's where I think a lot of the justification for what they're called meat waves has come from. That eventually Ukraine will run out of men to defend. Eventually Ukraine will run out of ammunition to defend. But they've been trying that for over 3 years now, and it hasn't worked. And now the average age for Russian recruitment, let me tell you the statistic. And these are some, I think, crucial data points for people who think that Ukraine has no cards. For one, the end of 2024, the average Russian recruit volunteer, the people who like I want to join the Russian armed forces, was 40. By the end of the year, it was 50 years old. So they're rapidly aging to your grandpa's age. So it's not just that the Ukrainians have older on age soldiers; it's that both Ukraine and Russia have had post-Soviet birth collapse, and now the only people who are joining are people who are looking at $4,000 a month and saying that's good for me, and joining at 50 years old because everybody else has said fuck that. I've seen the videos. You know, I don't want any part of that. And so they're lacking the manpower to keep this up forever unless they do another mass conscription wave where they say, screw it, we're doing mobilization. And you just have to fight the war. Now, the problem for doing that for Putin is the only time his popularity is actually, even according to Russian state polling, has gone down was when he did the first mobilization wave. And he's very scared that the more he includes the everyday Russian in the war, the less support there's going to be. And so that strategy for Russian victory, I think, is inherently flawed. That's not to say that they can't break through somewhere through, say, overbearing down on the line when it comes to munitions, or when it comes to, you know, eventually if they're able to remove all the sanctions and get more CNC machines through producing way more drones and way more shells and way more. That's something that really scares me, that Trump actually finds a way to remove sanctions on Russia. That is a pathway to their victory that makes sense to me. But that pathway of just mass waves or like just that force, I just don't see that as viable. But of course, that doesn't mean Russia cannot win. That's just to say that it is not destined, as many people talk about.
Yeah, I think you're right to talk about this from like a demographic perspective as well, because of course, you know, Russia has experienced a population collapse even outside of the people that they've lost in the war, which is not an inconsiderable amount. They're pulling from, you know, or when they do conscription, they would be pulling from already a very depleted chunk of the population, right? Because I know that they're like 15 to 30 range is pretty low on the population pyramid, right? Like they have relatively a lot of older people, a lot of people who are still, you know, fondly reminiscent of the Soviet Union. But for people like post that point, just not as many. So it kind of seems like Russia is setting itself up for long-term collapse anyway, right? Both for demographic reasons and the fact that it's kind of you need an excess population to conquer territory, which is the whole point of this, you know, from their end. It seems like it's a suicide pact, right? Like there's not really much sense in what they're doing. The strategy doesn't make much sense. It doesn't benefit their oligarchs. It doesn't benefit their people. They're high on their own supply. They believe their propaganda. Like you said, they think they can smash Ukraine.
If they take over Ukraine and they're able to keep it under their control, in their mind, they just added all of Ukraine and its resources and its manpower to it. And in the math, that could end up being a net benefit to the amount of land and resources they control. Definitely when it comes to, I mean, you know, maybe the people in the village have a certain value, but maybe the stuff under the villagers' feet could have an even more significant value to certain investment firms all over the world, where demographics matter to a certain degree. But you could also import North Korean workers, which the Russians just imported 15,000 North Korean workers to work in this defense industry in areas where they just don't have enough manpower to work it. So, I mean, they're trying to find workarounds that, you know, will make it so these long-term issues can at least be abated in the short term. But I mean, the slow demographic crawl is not something you can solve with North Korean internships, we'll call it.
Not to mention, like, even if they took more of Ukraine, right? The only reason the portion of Ukraine that they already control is more or less pacified is because it's been the victim of like decades and decades of state-backed separatist suppression, executions, people being deported or like pulled back into Russia. If they took over Ukraine, like the separatist movements, the amount of insurgency, it would go on forever. There would be literally no way of dealing with it. It would be impossible.
The trees in western Ukraine would shatter Ukrainian. It would be a very long and gruesome, difficult effort for them. But I also fear, I mean, what it would mean for the people. And of course, like at the end of the day, that people talk about like, oh, well, maybe you would reserve resources and manpower if these people are delusional. The Russians would, you don't reserve manpower by giving the hunter the hunted's village. That's not, that's not how you preserve manpower. I'm really hoping it never gets to any point like that.
No, God, yeah. Hopefully, I guess it's just kind of like it's shocking to think of in the long run, like no matter what path things take, it doesn't work out for Russia. It works out to varying extents for Ukraine. It just seems like um, it's difficult to think of geopolitics in the context of like rational nations theory when you understand that one side is being at least a little bit suicidal. It's a little bit harrowing. I mean, obviously they haven't like done anything super crazy, like busted out the nukes or whatever. Hopefully they never will. Hopefully they're not that suicidal. It just makes it difficult to sympathize with their intentions or wonder what from their end they think they're getting. Like you say, they're an empire, they want to add territory. I get that. It's just obviously the world doesn't work like that anymore.
Have you played Hearts of Iron?
No, at the frustration of my chat, I've been holding off on that actually.
Then don't talk to me about what's possible, okay? But when I listen to Putin, he does sound like somebody playing like a Hearts of Iron mod sometimes. He's just like on the Reddit boards, just going off on history. I mean, that's what it sounds like when he was talking to Tucker. I think Tucker kind of got thrown off a little
You're
bit
right. No,
because it
you're
was a
not wrong
little
on that.
much
Yeah.
egotism even for him.
Do you worry, so talking about like separatism and insurgency, there are a lot of Ukrainians with a very strong beef against Russia who have they've been given weapons, they've been given training. A lot of them have been given a lot of leeway in how they operate on the front, obviously, because we're in like that ground in like drone and trench warfare, you know, do what you can kind of. It's not like big overt operations with big fancy names. It's more like hold the line, do what you can, advance when you can. Do you worry that even after a peace is found, there might be problems on the Ukrainian side maintaining a ceasefire? That there are so many people that are so riled up that
Maybe back in 2014 and 2015 when the Ukrainian armed forces had like 6,000 effective soldiers. But I mean, I remember interviewing right sector guys. Those guys are as rowdy as you could probably imagine in the Ukrainian armed forces. These are people who didn't join the Ukrainian armed forces in many instances and stayed in the militias because they didn't like the regulations, because they didn't like being told this how you had to wear a uniform, how you had to cut your hair, or your eye injury disqualifies you from being a sniper. You say, screw that, I want to do it anyway. I can snipe with a glass eye, right? Like these people are, not necessarily what you would call number one rule followers. And when there was a scandal, I mean, the Ukrainian government came in and cracked down on it pretty hard. And so I'm of the opinion that the Ukrainian government has a pretty tight control on what units does. But that doesn't mean that that can't change. And what I mean by that is right now, the people on the front believe that the government behind them, the reason that they're doing all these, these confrontations in the Oval Office, the reason why Zelensky is being attacked so much, the reason why our government's under so much pressure is because our government's standing up for us. It's because the government's standing up for our land. It's because the government's standing up for Crimea. It's the government standing up for XYZ. Our government's standing up for our homes. And so if the government started doing something that was, say, not of that interest, I think certain units could maybe change their opinions. For example, if Zelensky agreed to give up Crimea without the Radas say so, which is what Trump wanted, I think that would possibly maybe not insult a rebellion, but start to make people murmur. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
It's because I've talked to people about this in the nationalist movement, the people who are supposed to be considered the most rowdy, and they're very dedicated to the idea that they swore an oath to Ukraine, not necessarily like Zelensky or any other government. Like the government right now is standing up for Ukraine, and so it's good or whatever. But if that changes, well, then they'll change what they do. So I don't think that this is an imminent threat, and I haven't seen any signs of this. But I mean, the Ukrainian people have shown that they're more than willing to challenge their government when they think it's out of line.
Yeah, it just reminds me a little bit of how some people say that Zelensky's approval ratings are falling within Ukraine, and they do so as part of a this rhetoric that like the Ukrainian people are tired of fighting. They want to get along with Russia, no more brother wars. And it's like, no, if you look at where internal opposition against Zelensky is coming from, it's not from people who want him to go easier on Russia at all, actually. There's a lot of people who are like vying to front the whole like, well, fuck the West, we don't need them, you know, we should
Some
be.
people's like, well, there was this corruption scandal. I believe I could manage the war better. There's some people like that, of
Yeah,
course.
right. It's
It's a
all,
whole,
they're united on the
it's internal
central
stuff that
point.
honestly, if these guys knew the internal stuff more, they could make much better propaganda. They just don't. They just don't bother. They just think Zelensky wife but big boat.
Yeah,
That's
no,
as far as
no
they
more
can
brother
do.
wars, no more brother wars. Meanwhile, like the, you know, the Russians and Ukrainians are, you know, gleefully, well, more so gleefully from the Ukrainian side. I can't imagine anyone over in the Russian side of the trenches is coming in that enthusiastic. Certainly not now. Maybe in the beginning of the war. I don't know. I am optimistic about the future. I mean, it seems like Russia is just burnt out on so much. Also, the global economic crisis that Trump did for no reason when he pressed the big red button called tariffs, the plummeting price of oil is probably going to cut into Russia's profits, their sort of like their profitability pretty soon, right? I know they've gone a good way towards depleting that national wealth fund that they've been using to fund the war. They might just flat run out of money, and I don't know how much people are going to take them at their legitimacy when it comes time to borrow to continue fighting.
I mean, there's a few problems. In order to fund the war, there was a lot of questions of how they done it. One of the ways they have investigations have shown is probably gutting much of the commercial banking sector. They of course have used up a decent amount of their gold supply, literally flying it around in planes, trying to like find ways to, you know, keep the economy afloat, also keep the war economy afloat, keep infrastructure running. As of course, it's not just like running your infrastructure normally during a war. Your infrastructure is put under a lot of pressure during a war. Your railroads, your roads, I mean, driving a tank over a road does a lot more damage than riding a car, is the basic way to put it. And they've had to do a lot to survive, and that means they have not inflation adjusted any of their, you know, aid or support to, you know, everyday Russians, meaning that in a lot of instances, poor people are actually finding that in more desperate economic circumstances, due to their support not being inflation adjusted and due to inflationary problems, they actually have less money than they did before the war, when now they actually need more money. A lot more people are going to get like support in Russia. Everyday goods are going up in price. Energy is going to be a question when it comes to energy prices in the future, as Gazprom is not reporting profits, and the energy companies are going to have to stay afloat, as these are the mechanisms by which the state funds the war. And so eventually you're going to have to cut into what the population is. I mean, even when it comes to like energy, point is, I don't want to ramble too much about like very specific Russian
No,
economic
please.
data. The general point is that the Russian economy is slowly degrading over time, and the question really is whether or not they can keep cannibalizing parts of it to keep it afloat, or possibly remove the pressure that has been placed upon it by sanctions. If they can do this long enough in order to come to a conclusion in the war that is favorable to them and favorable to the image of the regime. It's not really a question of whether or not Russia can do this balancing act forever. It can't. It's really a question of whether or not the Ukrainians can hold out for that long, continued political will from Europe can stand up for that long, and whether or not the Russian public is going to allow that to happen, even get to that point in the first place.
No, I think it's really interesting, because I think that's one of the things that people have gotten kind of confused and disillusioned about, which is how has Russia afforded the war? Russia didn't start this war a wealthy country, but we know what the Iraq war cost America. Like you would think by any conventional metrics, like Russia would have just bankrupted itself almost instantly. And it turns out, like you said, right, they're liquidating everything. You've got gold and commercial banking. You have the population, which to them is a lot cheaper than ours is to us, you know, for like in terms of labor costs and what we're willing to pay out for people who die. There's their stockpile of Cold War ammunition and machinery, but but it is all finite. Like, war does materially deplete nations of people, of resources, of wealth, and they're running thin in the esteem of their allies as well, right? Like, relatively, since the war began, it seems like India has managed itself a lot better keeping a distance from Russia, even though they've always been kind of like on the fence in terms of their support, since they're allied, and they pull weapons to them. Iran as well has other things on their table right now. China, of course, has beef with Russia. It just seems like they're exhausting through every possible option. And I think it's interesting to see what it looks like when a more or less modern country has to burn through everything. What would Russia even look like? I don't even know what Russia looks like outside of like Moscow, right? Because that's the impression I get. You've got Moscow, St. Petersburg, a few other major cities that are more or less taken care of, and then outside of that, just a infinite wasteland, a
I
sort
mean,
of
it's not
like
like an
steppe.
infinite waste. There's a lot of villages. There's a lot of smaller cities. You can go to like beautiful Murmansk. There's places across Russia, but I mean, there is a question of where is Russia's future if they've decided to respond to an already difficult demographic crisis before the war even started by taking their best and brightest, throwing them their most patriotic that sign up to fight your wars, people you would want to keep in your society, and you throw them into this meat grinder, wound them and maim them. And it's not a question of just the people who you've lost and they've died, but the people who are still with you. It's fantastic they're still with you, but now these are also going to become dependents on the government. So these are people that now, because of their wounds, are going to have to be continually paid by the government to keep them afloat, on top of the pensions of all of these people. And this is a burden that the government's going to carry. And those who, if they decide, like, what, we need to cut pensions for the veterans, the people that we just threw into Ukraine and had to do horrific things, we're going to piss those people off by cutting their pension. You put your country in an extremely difficult position when you're already heading into a demographic crisis, where how are you going to pay for the oldest among you when you don't have enough young people paying into your tax system? The hope was, energy, and maybe, with the burning up of the polar ice caps, they can find new trade routes. But if they continue to respond to the demographic crisis by making it worse, these long-standing Russian issues are just going to become worse and worse and worse. And I could try to talk about the other Russian economic issues, but there's nothing as devastating for the Russian economy long term than the fact that there's just not enough Russians.
It's yeah. I at the end of the day, it's all just macroeconomic shit. I don't know. I do think this is going to pan out favorably in the long term. Saving, I guess, the possibility of some like Joker mode nuclear launch. Obviously, I guess that's always like on the table in theory, but in practice, it's, a slog, and Russia knows what that would mean for them if they did that. So I guess until then, it's just really important to not give up on, say not give up on the war or Ukrainians, because that's obvious, I guess. It's more like understanding that this is an ongoing political and social project, right? Like, it goes beyond just how many square feet of territory does Ukraine gain or lose in any given year. It's more about like the political project of resisting the incursion, and in your case, for what you do, right? Like cataloging what it looks like, because there just isn't that much, there's like an oversaturation of information to an extent, where now that everyone's posting on social media, like every Ukrainian soldier is like screen recording the footage of the drone they just used to drop a grenade in a Russian trench. You have so much information, I think, that sometimes it seems less necessary to get more like substantial coverage. So for that and for everything else, I really do appreciate what you do.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. There is, I still think, an importance to getting on the ground and talking to people about their day-to-day experiences, and kind of showing a wider aperture, where I think in a lot of the quick information, where you just get like statistic here, statistic there, you don't really get the idea of what it's like to be a refugee, or what it's like to experience a drone bombardment, or the details about how a war crime occurs outside of the fact, oh, here's a number of how many occurred. It's just like I remember having the experience of being in Mykolaiv and being bombed for one of the first times, and then reading the report about how many people died in the news bulletin. It was just like, Mykolaiv bombing, 9 wounded, 3 dead, and that was it. And that was the whole. But for people in Mykolaiv, that was 12 hours of terror. And I don't think that a lot of the aperture of the suffering is properly displayed. I think the reports of what's the hunting of civilians in Kherson hasn't been properly displayed, or the reports of Russia's use of child suicide bombers, which terrify me, but have basically zero coverage in the West. If anybody's interested in that, there's a New Lines article about it in New Lines magazine, written by Michael Weiss and Jimmy Rushton, where the Russians are recruiting people off of Telegram, saying, hey, pick up this bag, it'll get you 3,000 hryvnias. Just take it here. They pick it up, they go there, there's a bunch of soldiers there, boom. And it's been done to 42-year-old women, 15-year-old kids. And, this type of, like, just saying, oh, there was a bombing there, doesn't show the aperture of the story of a child being used for that. And I think that's why we need more on-the-ground coverage and investigative journalism on the ground. And I hope that the big outlets invest more into, getting freelance journalists on the floor or buying their stories.
Yeah, no, 100%. Especially because you need like both a large quality and quantity of information to overwhelm what is, effectively a state-backed disinformation campaign on the on the conflict, right? Like, you're not just putting this information out into a void. You're trying to counter an ongoing, nonstop, 24/7 news barrage. I mean, you can see from Russian state media, it's fucking psychotic over there, and it's nonstop.
It's gotten all the way up to the top intelligence official.
Yeah, it seems, yeah, some of its greatest fans are they operate out of the federal government now. It's completely irrelevant to everything that you've just said, but just as like a closing note, because I think it's a little neat. I drove recently over to Mount Rainier in Washington to do some hiking, and there's actually, I believe it was set up recently, there's a Ukrainian restaurant in Ashford, the town that you have to pass through to get at the clearest run to Rainier, and it's cute. They got a little like barrel swing out the front. It's a cute place, big property, and we stopped by there when there was a power outage in Ashford, and they were serving authentic Ukrainian food by candlelight in the inside, and all the ladies were real nice. They even helped us get some snow tire chains.
Oh, what did you try? Did you try any food?
I didn't try any food because I was full, I'm afraid. It did look delicious, but I was full. Well, I paid for the chain, so I'm still supporting the material.
Vladimir Putin.
Maybe it goes, in remittances. It goes in remittances. Maybe I helped the effort. I don't know. But they were nice people.
No Vaush, no Putin, no Russian USA.
I'll probably be back. I promise I'll save my appetite for them next time, okay?
Give it a try. Give it a try. I know it's like stereotypical, but the borscht is just fantastic. If you get a really good homemade borscht, it's very fantastic. Also, I don't know if you've ever had Georgian food, but I love the khachapuri with cheese, man. If you ever get an opportunity.
I have not. I would love to. I've had borscht. I haven't had gachapon with cheese. I would, next time I'm through. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much. You have a good one. And I hope people check out my recent Kherson doc, which was released a month ago. If it's on Dylan Burns TV, anyone wants to check it out, or the doc that's going to be coming out this Saturday on my main channel.
They really should. It's far better than anything that I do.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
Take care. Have a good one.
Okay, see you later.
Guys, it's been a while since I've talked to Dylan. I can't believe how, I mean, he's on it, It's fucking crazy how much shit he does. Literally never heard about the suicide bomber thing before. Yeah, no. I think I read about it. I don't know if I read about the article that he's referring to. I might have, but I think it was like a maybe a reference to that article. No, it's pretty incredible. And by the way, listen, this sounds a little bit partisan, and I apologize. I'm really not trying to compare two bad bitches (parentheses war and genocide). That being said, I do. Okay, listen. As far as I'm concerned, in my mind, right up here, okay, Russia and Israel are like the same guy. Same type of propaganda, same mass disinfo campaign, same disingenuous appeal to the American federal government in an effort to like cloud the discussion, the topic. There's so many down to the specifics of the way they lie. Like there's so many similarities there, and I think it's just the way modern tech savvy, internet savvy, disinfo savvy governments like propagate misinformation. I don't think it's specific to them. I just think that they're two bad bitches in a pond or pod, whatever. I don't care. So there is a lot of coverage of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I just wish, okay, again, like I feel like this is like a left liberal thing because the liberals talk about Ukraine and the lefties talk about Gaza. I'm generalizing here. Basically, what I'm saying is like when people talk about the humanitarian consequences of what Israel's doing, just spare a thought for the Ukrainians too, I'm not saying that everyone who talks about the Palestinians doesn't care about the Ukrainians or vice versa. Again, I'm sorry, I'm being like overly defensive because I know this gets like because I'm not trying to do like a comparative thing. I'm just saying spare a thought. That's all I'm saying. Spare a thought. You know? Because you're dealing with the same enemy, right? You're dealing with ethno-nationalism, you're dealing with fascism, you're dealing with heavy oligarchical influence, more so in Russia than Israel, of course. There's different like types of projects, but there's also a big settler colonial vibe as well, right? Because settler colonialism is usually an extension of empire, and Russia's grab of Ukraine is like an imperial project, right? In a way, they're kind of doing like a reverse settler colonialism, sort of, because they're trying to obviously like settle Ukraine, but they're pulling Ukrainian children, they're kidnapping Ukrainian children, and pulling them into Russia to educate them as Russians to supplement their own demographic crisis. So it's like you understand what I mean. It's two bad bitches, but they're wearing the same lipstick, So just keep it in mind as a parallel.